friends! It's time for reading. Be sure that you have your Charlotte's Web book, your comprehension questions, and your vocab list before we get started. If you don't have your materials, then just push pause and grab your materials and come back and join us. We only have one vocab word for this reading. We're going to read chapters 14 and 15 today, which will start on page 105. Dr. Dorian is where we're going to start for today. If you are unable to print your comprehension questions, just make sure that you pull them up on RenWeb so that you can look at them, and then you can answer the questions on a separate sheet of paper. It's okay by me. But if you're able to print them and you can, that would be great. Our questions for these two chapters are two essay questions, and this is the page that you should have. Chapters 14 and 15. Question 1 says, the book tells us that when Charlotte described Wilbur as radiant or terrific, Wilbur did his best to be these things. Do you think the same thing could happen to humans? If someone tells you that they believe in you, do you think you are more likely to do a better job or try to be your best? And please give an example. So when Charlotte told Wilbur that he was radiant or terrific, he tried very hard to be those things. What I want to know is if you think that could happen to humans. Could that happen to you, and has it happened to you? And give an example. And you're gonna answer that question in 2 complete sentences. Don't forget your capital letter, your punctuation. Make sure that your words are in the right order and that you have a complete thought. 2 sentences for that one. The second question says, why didn't Charlotte think that she could go to the fair, that she should go to the fair with Wilbur? Why didn't Charlotte think she should go to the fair with Wilbur? Our vocabulary word for this reading is in chapter 15, and it's versatile. And the word versatile means able to do many things well. So be watching for that word in chapter 15, and let's see if we can find it at the same time. So we're going to start with chapter 14, page 105. I want you to follow with your eyes, follow the words, and listen for my inflection, listen for my expression. When I read, listen for the pauses, and I want you to do your best to follow along. Are you ready? Dr. Dorian. The next day was Saturday. Fern stood at the kitchen sink, drying the breakfast dishes as her mother washed them. Mrs. Arable worked silently. She hoped Fern would go out and play with other children instead of heading for Zuckerman's barn to sit and watch animals. Charlotte is the best storyteller I ever heard, said Fern, poking her dish towel into a cereal bowl. Fern, her mother said sternly, you must not invent things. You know spiders don't tell stories. Spiders can't talk. Charlotte can, replied Fern. She doesn't talk very loud, but she talks. What kind of story did she tell? Asked Mrs. Arable. Well, began Fern, she told us about a cousin of hers who caught a fish in her web. Don't you think that's fascinating? Fern, dear, how would a fish get in a spider's web? Said Mrs. Arable. You know it couldn't happen. You're making this up. Oh, it happened all right, replied Fern. Charlotte never fibs. This cousin of hers built a web across a stream. One day she was hanging around on a web, and a tiny fish leaped into the air and got tangled in the web. The fish was caught by one fin. Mother, its tail was wildly thrashing and shining in the sun. Can't you just see the web sagging dangerously under the weight of the fish? Charlotte's cousin kept slipping in, dodging out, and she was beaten mercilessly over the head by the wildly thrashing fish, dancing in, dancing out, throwing— Fern! Snapped her mother. Stop it! Stop inventing these wild tales. I'm not inventing, said Fern. I'm just telling you the facts. What finally happened? Asked her mother, whose curiosity began to get the better of her. Charlotte's cousin won. She wrapped the fish up, then she ate him when she got good and ready. Spiders have to eat the same as the rest of us. "Yes, I suppose they do," said Mrs. Arable vaguely. "Charlotte has another cousin who is a balloonist. She stands on her head, lets out a lot of line, and is carried aloft on the wind. Mother, wouldn't you simply love to do that?" "Yes, I would, come to think of it," replied Mrs. Arable. "But Fern, darling, I wish you would play outdoors today instead of going to Uncle Homer's barn. Find some of your playmates to do something nice outdoors. You're spending too much time in that barn. It isn't good for you to be alone so much." "Alone?" said Fern. "Alone? My best friends are in the barn cellar. It is a very sociable place, not at all lonely." Fern disappeared after a while, walking down the road toward Zuckerman's. Her mother dusted the sitting room. As she worked, she kept thinking about Fern. It didn't seem natural for a little girl to be so interested in animals. Finally, Mrs. Arable made up her mind she would pay a call on old Dr. Dorian and ask his advice. She got in the car and drove to his office in the village. Dr. Dorian had a thick beard. He was glad to see Mrs. Arable and gave her a comfortable chair. "It's about Fern," she explained. "Fern spends entirely too much time in the Zuckerman's barn. It doesn't seem normal. She sits on a milk stool in a corner of the barn cellar near the pig pen and watches animals hour after hour. She just sits and listens." Dr. Dorian leaned back and closed his eyes. "How enchanting," he said. "It must be real nice and quiet down there. Homer has some sheep, hasn't he?" "Yes," said Mrs. Arable, "but it all started with that pig we let Fern raise on a bottle. She calls him Wilbur. Homer bought the pig, and ever since it left our place, Fern has been going to her uncle's to be near it." "I've been hearing things about that pig," said Dr. Dorian, opening his eyes. "They say he's quite a pig." "Have you heard about the words that appeared in the spider's web?" asked Mrs. Arable nervously. "Yes," replied the doctor. "Well, do you understand it?" asked Mrs. Arable. "Understand what?" "Do you understand how there could be any writing in a spider's web?" "Oh, no," said Dr. Dorian, "I don't understand it. But for that matter, I don't understand how a spider learned to spin a web in the first place. When the words appeared, everyone said they were a miracle, but nobody pointed out that the web itself is a miracle." "What's miraculous about a spider's web?" said Mrs. Arable. "I don't see why you say a web is a miracle. It's just a web." "Ever try to spin one?" asked Dr. Dorian. Mrs. Arable shifted uneasily in her chair. "No," she replied, "but I can crochet a doily, and I can knit a sock." "Sure," said the doctor, "but somebody taught you, didn't they?" "My mother taught me." "Well, who taught a spider?" "A young spider knows how to spin a web without any instructions from anybody. Don't you regard that as a miracle?" "I suppose so," said Mrs. Arable. "I never looked at it that way before. Still, I don't understand how those words got into the web. I don't understand it, and I don't like what I can't understand." I want to pause right there because he asks an interesting question. He says, "Who taught a spider?" Now we know that nobody taught a spider. But when God said those few words, those few spoken words, "Let there be," remember that those few words came with all the things that were needed for every animal to do what God intended for it to do. So when he said, "Let there be," insects and spiders and birds and animals in the sea and animals on the ground, he gave them those instincts and those behaviors that make those animals do what they do and survive the way that they survive. So Mrs. Arable said, "I don't understand it, and I don't like what I can't understand." "None of us do," said Dr. Dorian, sighing. "I'm a doctor. Doctors are supposed to understand everything. But I don't understand everything, and I don't intend to let it worry me." Mrs. Arable fidgeted. "Fern says the animals talk to each other. Dr. Dorian, do you believe animals talk?" "I never heard one say anything," he replied, "but that proves nothing. It is quite possible that an animal has spoken civilly to me, and I didn't catch the remark because I wasn't paying attention. Children pay attention better than grown-ups. If Fern says the animals in Zuckerman's barn talk, I'm quite ready to believe her. Perhaps, if people talked less, animals would talk more. People are incessant talkers. I can give you my word on that. And we'll pause right there because just in case you may not know what the word incessant means, that means without stopping, on and on and on. People are incessant talkers. Well, I feel better about Fern, said Mrs. Arable. You don't think I need to worry about her? Does she look well? Asked the doctor. Oh, yes. Appetite good? Oh, yes, she's always hungry. Sleep well at night? Oh, yes. Then don't worry, said the doctor. Do you think she'll ever start thinking about something besides pigs and sheep and geese and spiders? How old is Fern? She's 8. Well, said Dr. Dorian, I think she will always love animals, but I doubt that she spends her entire life in Homer Zuckerman's barn cellar. How about boys? Does she know any boys? She knows Henry Fussy, said Mrs. Arable brightly. Dr. Dorian closed his eyes again and went into deep thought. Henry Fussy, he mumbled. Remarkable. Well, I don't think you have anything to worry about. Let Fern associate with her friends in the barn if she wants to. I would say offhand that spiders and pigs were fully as interesting as Henry Fussy. Yet I predict that the day will come when even Henry will drop some chance remark that catches Fern's attention. It's amazing how children change from year to year. How's Avery? He asked, opening his eyes wide. Oh, Avery, chuckled Mrs. Arable. Avery's always fine. Of course he gets into poison ivy and gets stung by wasps and bees and brings frogs and snakes home and breaks everything he lays his hands on. He's fine. Good, said the doctor. Mrs. Arable said goodbye and thanked Dr. Dorian very much for his advice. She felt greatly relieved. If you need to pause right here and go get a drink or take a quick little break, you can, but we're going to start chapter 15, The Crickets, and that's on page 113. The crickets sang in the grasses. They sang the song of summer's ending, a sad, monotonous song. Summer is over and gone, they sang, over and gone, over and gone. Summer is dying, dying. The crickets felt it was their duty to warn everybody that summertime cannot last forever. Even on the most beautiful days in the whole year, the days when summer is changing into fall, the crickets spread the rumor of sadness and change. Everybody heard the song of the crickets. Avery and Fern Arable heard it as they walked the dusty road. They knew that school would soon begin again. The young geese heard it and knew that they would never be goslings again. Charlotte heard it and knew that she hadn't much time left. Mrs. Zuckerman, at work in the kitchen, heard the crickets, and a sadness came over her, too. Another summer gone, she sighed. Lurvy, at work building a crate for Wilbur, heard the song and knew it was time to dig potatoes. Summer is over and gone, repeated the crickets. How many nights till frost, sang the crickets. Goodbye, summer. Goodbye, goodbye. The sheep heard the crickets, and they felt so uneasy they broke a hole in the pasture fence and wandered up into the field across the road. The gander discovered the hole and led his family through, and they walked to the orchard and ate the apples that were lying on the ground. A little maple tree in the swamp heard the cricket's song and turned bright red with anxiety. Wilbur was now the center of attraction on the farm. Good food and regular hours were showing the results. Wilbur was a pig any man would be proud of. One day, more than 100 people came to stand at his yard and admire him. Charlotte had written the word radiant, and Wilbur really looked radiant as he stood in the golden sunlight. Ever since the spider had befriended him, he had done his best to live up to his reputation. When Charlotte's web said some pig, Wilbur had tried hard to look like some pig. When Charlotte's web said terrific, Wilbur had tried to look terrific. And now that the web said radiant, he did everything possible to make himself glow. It is not easy to look radiant, but Wilbur threw himself into it with a will. He would turn his head slightly and blink his long eyelashes. Then he would breathe deeply. When the audience grew bored, he would spring into the air and do a backflip with a half twist. At this, the crowd would yell and cheer, "How's that for a pig?" Mr. Zuckerman would ask, well pleased with himself, "That pig is radiant." Some of Wilbur's friends in the barn worried for fear all this attention would go to his head and make him stuck up. But it never did. Wilbur was modest. Fame did not spoil him. He still worried some about the future, and he could hardly believe that a mere spider would be able to save his life. Sometimes at night he would have a bad dream. He would dream that men were coming to get him with knives and guns. But that was only a dream. In the daytime, Wilbur usually felt happy and confident. No pig ever had truer friends, and he realized that friendship is one of the most satisfying things in the world. Even the song of the crickets did not make Wilbur too sad. He knew it was almost time for the county fair, and he was looking forward to the trip. If he could distinguish himself at the fair and maybe win some prize money, he was sure Zuckerman would let him live. Charlotte had worries of her own, but she kept quiet about them. One morning Wilbur asked her about the fair. "You're going to go with me, aren't you, Charlotte?" he said. "Well, I don't know," replied Charlotte. "The fair comes at a bad time for me. I shall find it inconvenient to leave home even for a few days." "Why?" asked Wilbur. "Oh, I just don't feel like leaving my web. Too much going on around here." "Please come with me," begged Wilbur. "I need you, Charlotte. I can't stand going to the fair without you. You've just got to come." "No," said Charlotte. "I believe I'd better stay home and see if I can't get some work done." "What kind of work?" asked Wilbur. "Egg laying. It's time I made an egg sack and filled it with eggs." "I didn't know you could lay eggs," said Wilbur in amazement. "Oh, sure," said the spider. "I'm versatile. That's our vocab word, able to do many things well." "What does versatile mean? Full of eggs?" asked Wilbur. "Certainly not," said Charlotte. "Versatile means I can turn with ease from one thing to another. It means I don't have to limit my activities to spinning and trapping and stunts like that." "Why don't you come with me to the fairgrounds and lay your eggs there?" pleaded Wilbur. "It would be wonderful fun." Charlotte gave her web a twitch and moodily watched it sway. "I'm afraid not," she said. "You don't know the first thing about egg-laying, Wilbur. I can't arrange my family duties to suit the management of the county fair. When I get ready to lay eggs, I have to lay eggs, fair or no fair. However, I don't want you to worry about it. You might lose weight. We'll leave it this way. I'll come to the fair if I possibly can." "Oh, good," said Wilbur. "I knew you wouldn't forsake me when I need you most." All that day Wilbur stayed inside, taking life easy in the straw. Charlotte rested and ate a grasshopper. She knew that she couldn't help Wilbur much longer. In a few days she would have to drop everything and build the beautiful little sack that would hold her eggs. So let's review our questions again that you're going to answer. The first question said, the book tells us that when Charlotte described Wilbur as radiant or terrific, Wilbur tried his best to be these things. And if you remember, very recently, you wrote a persuasive paper, something that you believed strongly about and that you were going to convince someone else to believe the same way that you believed. And in the same way, Charlotte persuaded Wilbur to believe that he was indeed radiant and terrific, that he was some pig. And the more that people believed that he was some pig and that he was terrific and radiant, Wilbur believed it even more and tried his best to be those things. That's why, my friends, we say the Pledge to Achieve every single day. Because the more that you hear it, the more that you say it, the more you start to believe it. And the more that you start to be those things. I am respectful, responsible, and ready to learn. The more that you say those things and believe them, the more that you start to be them. That could be one example of how that could work for a human, because the second part of this says, do you think the same thing could happen to humans? I don't know. Think about how you felt about the Pledge to Achieve at the beginning of the year and how you feel about it now. Think about something that somebody told you one time that maybe you didn't believe at first about yourself, but then you believed it later on. If somebody tells you that they believe in you, do you think you're more likely to do a better job or try to be your best? I want you to think about that nice and long and hard, and I want you to give me 2 sentences with an example of if you think this could happen to humans, and if you think you're more likely to do a better job or to do your best. But be specific with your example. And then the second question is, why didn't Charlotte think she should go to the fair with Wilbur? I hope that you enjoyed our time together. We'll do this again tomorrow. We'll read chapters 16 through 18. We'll talk about our vocab words and the questions, but I hope that you have a wonderful rest of the day, and thank you for taking a break to read with me for these few minutes. I love you very much. Bye.